I thought staying at his house would be simple, then she smiled and said, "You can sleep in his room, or mine." I arrived at her doorstep just as the late afternoon sun was melting into the horizon, painting the street in warm amber tones. My backpack felt heavier than it should, weighed down not just by my belongings but by the nervous anticipation coiling in my chest. This wasn't a simple favor. This was stepping into someone else's life, someone else's home, a life I had only glimpsed from a distance before. She opened the door before I could knock, framed by the soft glow of the hallway behind her. She was taller than I remembered, with a graceful presence that seemed to fill the room without effort. Her hair fell just past her shoulders, catching the fading sunlight, and there was a quiet elegance in the way she moved, measured yet effortless. She smiled, and it wasn't the casual, polite smile of a host, it held warmth, curiosity, and a subtle tease that made my chest tighten. "Come in," she said, her voice soft yet steady. It carried a calm authority that made me feel instantly observed, like she could read more than I intended to reveal. The scent of her perfume, something floral but understated, lingered in the air, and I realized I was noticing every detail, the faint warmth of her skin as she reached past me to pull the door fully open, the faint hum of her refrigerator from the kitchen, the soft rug under my shoes. We stepped into the living room together, and the house felt lived in, comfortable, yet charged with a subtle energy that made my pulse quicken. The furniture was warm-toned, arranged in a way that suggested both practicality and care, with little personal touches, a vase of fresh flowers, a photograph on the mantel, a knitted throw casually draped over the arm of the couch. My eyes caught hers across the room, and I felt a small, inexplicable flutter, a mix of admiration, curiosity, and something else I wasn't ready to name. As she guided me toward the rooms, I noticed the way she moved around her home, confident, aware, but with small gestures that hinted at quiet vulnerability. A hand lingered briefly on the back of a chair when she passed it, a slight tilt of her head when considering my presence. She opened the first door, gesturing inside with a light laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This could be yours," she said, and my stomach nodded, not from the room, but from the intimacy of her attention. We walked past another door, and she paused, letting her hand rest lightly on the frame. "Or, this one," she added, her tone softer this time, almost like she was sharing a secret rather than offering a choice. My mind raced, unsure whether to focus on practicality or the subtle, almost imperceptible undercurrent in her words. The air seemed charged, thick with possibilities I wasn't entirely ready to confront. Even as I unpacked a few essentials, I found myself stealing glances at her, noticing the way the sunlight played across her features, the gentle rise and fall of her chest when she laughed softly at some mundane thought. In that moment, I understood, this day wasn't just about shelter. It was the beginning of something more, something quiet and complex, like a slow current beneath the surface. And somehow, I knew that by choosing to step inside her home, I had stepped into a story that would change the rhythm of my days in ways I wasn't yet ready to understand. Dinner had just ended, the lingering aroma of roasted vegetables and warm bread still clinging faintly to the kitchen. I helped clear the plates, moving quietly, trying not to overstep the invisible boundary of her home. She moved around me with a fluid grace, her presence comforting yet disorienting, like sunlight shifting through a window just at the wrong angle. Then she paused, leaning against the counter, and turned to look at me with a small, knowing smile. "You'll need a place to sleep," she said softly, and my chest tightened at the simplicity of her words. Not because of practicality, but because of the way she said them, as though the decision was far more nuanced than it sounded. I nodded, uncertain. "Yes, thank you." She gestured toward the hallway. "You can sleep in his room, or mine." The words hung in the air, playful yet loaded with implication. My stomach flipped, a mix of confusion and something else I couldn't immediately identify. The casualness of her tone clashed with the weight of what she had just offered. I looked toward the rooms, trying to steady my racing thoughts. One was familiar, orderly, and distinctly his, practical, predictable. The other, hers, held an aura of warmth, subtle elegance, and a quiet intimacy that made my pulse thrum against my ribs. I cleared my throat, a tempting casualness I didn't feel. She chuckled softly, the sound low and warm, vibrating gently in the air between us. I'm serious, she said, eyes meeting mine directly. There was no pressure, only an openness that felt strangely intimate, a test and an invitation all at once. Her gaze lingered, and for a fleeting second, I became acutely aware of every detail, the soft curve of her jaw, the tilt of her head, the way her fingers brushed the counter as she leaned slightly forward. The room seemed to shrink around us, every breath and movement magnified in the quiet tension. My mind raced, not wanting to overstep, yet unable to ignore the subtle pull. I don't want to make things awkward, I finally said, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Awkward, she repeated, tilting her head. We're all adults here. I trust you. Besides, her lips curved in a teasing smile, it's not about awkwardness. It's about comfort. Which do you think you'd feel more at ease in? Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the counter, close enough that I noticed the warmth radiating from her skin. I felt an odd tension, a magnetic pull I didn't fully understand, yet I instinctively wanted to respect her space. Every instinct told me to choose prudence, yet my curiosity and the quiet thrill of the unknown urged me to linger, to explore what lay behind that gentle yet daring offer. I swallowed, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. I suppose I should start with his room, I said finally, trying to anchor myself in normalcy. She smiled again, softer this time, almost approvingly, though her eyes held a glint of unspoken amusement. Fair enough, she said, but the way she lingered in the doorway suggested that the choice was more than practical, it was an opening, a subtle test of boundaries, of attention, of desire unspoken. And as I carried my bag down the hallway toward the familiar room, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the house felt now, every footstep echoing with the unspoken tension of possibilities that neither of us dared to name, yet. The next morning, sunlight spilled lazily through the kitchen windows, casting long golden lines across the floor. I was up early, fumbling with the coffee maker, still adjusting to the rhythm of a house that wasn't mine. She appeared in the doorway, barefoot, holding a mug of tea, and for a moment I froze, not because of her beauty, which was undeniable, but because of the quiet ease she carried. She didn't rush, didn't announce herself. She simply existed in the space, and I found myself acutely aware of the small details, the softness of her pajama top, the gentle sway of her hair as she moved, the faint floral scent lingering in the air. Morning, she said softly, her voice warm and unassuming. Morning, I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. We moved around the kitchen in a synchronized dance, clearing dishes and preparing breakfast without needing words for most of it. Yet every glance, every small gesture carried weight. My hand brushed hers briefly as I handed her the butter knife. A spark traveled up my arm, subtle but unmistakable, as our eyes met for a fraction longer than necessary. She smiled slightly, eyes crinkling at the corners, but said nothing. That silence, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement, made my heart thrum faster. After breakfast, we settled into the living room. I took a book from the shelf, she curled up on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a throw draped over her shoulders. I sat nearby, careful to give space, yet drawn closer by the soft warmth radiating from her presence. Occasionally, our hands would brush against each other as we reached for the same cushion or shared a page of the book I held. Each accidental touch lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I felt a quiet tension simmering beneath the ordinary. We laughed over small, trivial things, a misread recipe, a forgotten spice, a dog barking in the distance, but in every laugh, every glance, the distance between us felt charged with a silent intimacy. She leaned back, stretching, and I noticed the way the afternoon light caught the curve of her neck, the subtle movement of her shoulder beneath the fabric. I wanted to look away, to respect boundaries, yet I couldn't. Every detail seemed amplified in her presence. Later, I found myself helping her with chores, folding laundry, organizing books, watering plants. She guided me with patience, her hand occasionally brushing mine as she corrected my clumsiness, each contact sending a quiet warmth through me. There was an unspoken rhythm forming, a subtle harmony between us, where comfort and curiosity intertwined. Even the mundane became intimate. Sharing a snack on the balcony, watching the sun dip lower, feeling the gentle brush of her sleeve against mine as she reached for her cup, these small moments grounded me in the quiet reality of her world. They were innocent touches, fleeting, yet each one carried a charge I couldn't ignore. By the time evening settled in, I realized that the house felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a space where something delicate, unspoken, and electrifying was beginning to grow. The tension wasn't loud or overt, it was in the way she laughed, the subtle warmth of her presence, the way she allowed me to exist close without crossing boundaries. I understood, with a mix of awe and apprehension, that these ordinary moments were quietly binding us together, threading a slow, persistent intimacy that neither of us had yet named. And in that stillness, I felt it, the subtle pull, the quiet promise, of a connection that was only just beginning to reveal its depth. Days passed in a gentle rhythm, each one building the quiet intimacy that now threaded through the house. I found myself noticing things I hadn't before, the way her laughter softened when she was alone in the kitchen, the slight crease between her brows when she focused on a task, the calm steadiness in her movements that made the room feel warmer, more grounded. It wasn't just admiration, it was a magnetic pull I couldn't name, and it left me both exhilarated and uncertain. One evening, I found her in the living room, curled up on the couch, her eyes lost in the pages of a novel. The room was bathed in the fading glow of sunset, orange light spilling across the floorboards. I hesitated in the doorway, pretending to adjust the blinds, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. She looked up briefly, our gazes meeting, and there was a flicker of recognition, something unspoken, an acknowledgement that we both felt the tension lurking beneath our interactions. I told myself it was inappropriate to think of her this way. She wasn't just a woman I admired, she was the mother of someone I cared about, someone I respected. Yet my chest tightened when her fingers brushed the edge of the book, and I caught myself imagining the warmth of her hand lingering in mine. The air between us seemed charged with possibility, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more acute it became. Later, I offered to help with dinner, and she leaned over the counter to reach for an ingredient. Our hands brushed, and this time, I didn't pull away. Her fingers lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, and a quiet shiver ran up my spine. She looked at me then, her gaze steady but soft, as though she had noticed too. I swallowed, trying to anchor myself in propriety, yet there was no denying the pull that had formed between us, a pull that was subtle, restrained, but undeniably real. I began to catch myself stealing glances, when she passed by, when she laughed at something mundane, when she focused intently on a task. Each moment felt heavy with potential, yet every time our eyes met, a silent restraint held us apart. There was longing there, yes, but there was also respect, hesitation, and a careful awareness of boundaries neither of us wanted to cross too soon. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, the quiet of the house pressing against me. I could hear her moving softly in the next room, the faint rustle of clothing, the gentle sigh that betrayed her own weariness. And in that stillness, I realized just how much I wanted to reach across that invisible divide, to bridge the distance between us. Yet even as the desire rose, so did the fear of misreading signals, fear of overstepping, fear of tainting the fragile comfort we had built. It was a conflict I couldn't resolve, a tension that neither time nor distance could dissipate. The house felt alive with the subtle energy of unspoken attraction, each glance and touch charged with meaning we dared not name aloud. And as I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I understood that the real story wasn't in the choices we had made so far, it was in the quiet storm building between us, a storm of longing, hesitation, and the fragile promise of something far deeper than either of us had anticipated. The night had settled into a soft hush, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of a streetlight outside. I was in the living room, nursing a cup of tea, when she appeared in the doorway, barefoot and wrapped in a light sweater. She paused when she saw me, her eyes meeting mine with that calm, knowing look that always made my chest tighten. "Can I sit?" she asked softly, her voice low enough that it barely disturbed the silence. "Of course," I replied, shifting slightly to make room on the couch. She settled beside me, close enough that the warmth from her presence brushed against mine. The subtle scent of her perfume mingled with the faint aroma of tea, and for a moment, I simply existed in the quiet intimacy of being near her. We sipped in silence for a few minutes, the comfort of unspoken understanding settling over us. Then, almost hesitantly, she spoke. "Do you ever feel like no one really sees you?" I looked at her, surprised at the vulnerability in her question. There was no performance, no attempt to appear strong, just honesty, raw and unguarded. I felt a lump form in my throat as I realized how much I wanted to reach out, to bridge the space between us, yet not overstep. "Yes," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. "Sometimes. I feel like I carry a lot alone, and nobody notices until I let it show." Her gaze softened, and she turned slightly to face me. "Exactly. That's why it's refreshing to have someone who just notices. Someone who doesn't expect you to be perfect all the time." She paused, her hand brushing briefly against mine as she gestured toward the cup in my hands. The contact was light, fleeting, yet it sent a quiet shiver through me. We talked then, truly talked, for the first time beyond small talk and polite conversation. She shared memories of her own struggles, the loneliness that sometimes shadowed her accomplishments, and the quiet fears she rarely voiced to anyone. I listened, captivated by the mixture of strength and vulnerability, feeling the magnetic pull that had been growing between us intensify. I shared my own fears, my hesitation about staying here, and the awkward longing I hadn't yet found the courage to name. There was a rhythm to our conversation, a give and take that felt almost sacred. Each word, each pause, each fleeting glance built a bridge between us. When she laughed softly at something I said, it was tinged with warmth, and I noticed the subtle movement of her fingers brushing mine as she reached for her cup again. The touch was brief, innocent, yet it carried more intimacy than anything spoken aloud. By the time we fell into a comfortable silence, I realized something profound. The connection between us wasn't just attraction, it was trust, it was understanding, it was the kind of quiet intimacy that few ever experience. The room felt smaller, warmer, more alive, and I knew, deep down, that this night had shifted everything. The slow burn between us was no longer just a simmer, it was quietly blazing beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. And as I watched her finally rise and retreat to her own room, I felt a mixture of awe and anticipation, knowing that the foundation of our bond had been laid, not through grand gestures, but through honesty, vulnerability, and the subtle, electrifying power of shared understanding. The evening was quiet, the house wrapped in the soft hum of night. I had been reading on the couch when I heard her sigh from the kitchen. Curious, I rose to check on her, and found her leaning against the counter, rubbing her temples lightly. "Long day," she murmured, almost to herself. "Do you want some help?" I asked, moving closer. Her head lifted, and for a moment, the weight of the day seemed to melt from her shoulders as she gave me a faint, tired smile. "I'd appreciate that," she said softly, stepping aside to let me handle the dishes. Our hands met briefly in the sink, warm and steady, and I felt a quiet spark in that fleeting contact. It wasn't just touch, it was trust, the acknowledgement of proximity without need for words. Later, she had to reach up to a high shelf, and I stepped forward instinctively, offering a hand to steady her. Her fingers brushed mine as she grasped the shelf edge, and her eyes met mine. That glance held a strange weight, intimate yet restrained, as though she understood exactly what I was feeling and didn't need it spoken aloud. I felt the pull of longing, the magnetic tension that had been simmering since my arrival, coiling tighter in my chest. We paused there, mere inches apart. I was acutely aware of her presence, the faint warmth radiating from her skin, the soft scent of her perfume, the delicate rise and fall of her breath. My own breath hitched slightly, and for a heartbeat, I imagined letting that distance collapse completely, letting the moment carry us somewhere unspoken. But restraint held me in check, respect and propriety pressed down against desire, even as it throbbed insistently. She chuckled softly, shaking her head at the awkward silence, and the tension broke just enough for both of us to exhale. "Thank you," she said, her hand lingering a moment longer on mine before she pulled away. That small, deliberate contact was more electrifying than any overt gesture could have been. Later, as we sat together on the couch, the room dimly lit by a single lamp, I noticed how close we had unconsciously positioned ourselves. Our legs nearly touched, the warmth between us quiet but palpable. She reached for the throw, brushing against my arm as she adjusted it around herself, and my pulse skipped at the fleeting intimacy. We talked quietly, sharing trivialities, but each word felt laden with subtext, each glance weighted with unspoken meaning. Every small gesture, the way she leaned back just slightly against the couch, the casual brush of her hand across mine, the softness in her voice when she laughed, was a dance of subtle desire and mutual restraint. By the end of the evening, I realized something undeniable: the connection between us had deepened beyond mere attraction. It was trust, longing, and a quiet awareness of each other's presence, all coexisting in a fragile, intoxicating balance. The moment of choice hadn't required explicit action. It had been in every touch, every glance, every shared breath, the small, intimate decisions that left both of us acutely aware of the slow-burning tension that now defined our relationship. As she finally excused herself for the night, leaving me with the echo of her presence, I knew the boundaries between us had shifted. Something had been awakened, delicate yet persistent, and I was keenly aware that the next step, when it came, would be the most significant decision of all. The morning sun filtered gently through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the living room. The house felt calm, familiar, and yet alive with a quiet intimacy that had developed over the past days. I found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she arranged breakfast, and for a moment, I paused in the doorway, drinking in the simple grace of her movements, the way her fingers lightly touched the edge of the counter, the soft sway of her hair as she leaned over the fruit bowl. "Good morning," I said softly. She looked up, and her eyes met mine with that calm, knowing warmth I had grown to cherish. "Good morning," she replied, a gentle smile tugging at her lips. There was no teasing this time, no playful ambiguity, just a quiet, open acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between us. We moved through the morning with a sense of ease, the shared silences as meaningful as our words. I poured coffee while she buttered toast, our hands brushing lightly as we reached for the same utensils. Each touch was brief but deliberate, carrying the weight of unspoken feelings. I realized that what had begun as subtle tension had blossomed into something profoundly comforting, a deep, mutual understanding and trust that neither of us had expected but both had quietly hoped for. Later, we sat on the couch together, not out of necessity, but because proximity had become a natural rhythm. She leaned slightly against me, her shoulder brushing mine, and I could feel the steady warmth of her body. Her hand found mine on the armrest, fingers interlacing gently, the gesture simple yet charged with meaning. It was a touch that spoke of comfort, desire, and quiet reassurance all at once. We spoke of ordinary things, plans for the day, small memories, trivial laughter, but underneath it all was a profound emotional intimacy. We shared glances that lingered just a fraction longer than needed, small smiles that conveyed more than words ever could, and moments of silence that were rich with shared understanding. There was no rush, no pressure, only the quiet satisfaction of two people discovering a connection that was real, deep, and mutual. As the afternoon sun softened, we found ourselves in the living room, basking in the warmth of both the sunlight and each other's presence. She reached over, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, and I felt a gentle shiver run through me, not from passion, but from the closeness, the trust, the comfort of being seen and accepted fully. I returned the gesture lightly, my fingers grazing her cheek with the softest touch. In that simple exchange, everything was clear: our bond had evolved naturally, without force or urgency, into something profoundly intimate and emotionally fulfilling. The slow-burn tension that had threaded through our days had resolved into quiet contentment, an understanding that we belonged together in this shared space, in this moment, without needing to label or rush the next step. And as we settled side by side, hands entwined and hearts quietly aligned, I understood that some connections, fragile yet steadfast, didn't need grand gestures to flourish. They thrived in small touches, lingering glances, and the simple, undeniable warmth of being close to someone who sees you, truly and entirely. The house, the moments, and her presence had become a sanctuary, not just of shelter, but of trust, affection, and a love that had grown slowly, deliberately, and beautifully. If you enjoyed this story and the quiet tension between them, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another slow burn romance. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in his shoes?